Please join me in welcoming Keith Leslie as he gives us the international perspective on public sector leadership in the age of austerity.
Thanks. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak with you. This is, as Linda said, the slot where an international speaker reassures you that there's always someone who's a whole lot worse off than you are. I'm also probably going to confirm your worst suspicions about consultants, because I've been giving variations on this speech roughly every 2 weeks for the last 18 months. And the slides don't change. The title slide, of course, changes a little. But the reality is I'm going to take you through 4 slides of substance, 3 of which have not changed in 18 months. 1 new one's come in, 1 old one went out. But what I say to them has changed enormously because of what we've been through roughly 18 months of traveling through uncharted territory. So 2 comments on the title before I go any further. The first one is on the age of austerity. Our government in the UK, prior to the general election last May, before the crisis struck in 2007, was running a government deficit of about 4% of GDP. Now, as a Scotsman, of course, it causes me great distress to ever be spending more than one is taking in. Okay, thank you. But leaving that aside, 4% of GDP as a government deficit was already, as I'm proud to say, we put on the record in 2007, unsustainable. The crisis then hit. Tax revenue went down by 3% of GDP. Spending on welfare and other benefits to compensate, the automatic compensating benefits, went up by 2% of GDP. And then there was a fiscal stimulus, not dissimilar to Canada's, of roughly 2% of GDP. Now, you add all of those percentages up, and pretty soon you get to talking about real money. So going into the general election last year, through the current fiscal year, the UK has been running a deficit of 11% of GDP, so roughly 200 billion Canadian dollars. So an enormous deficit. The voters spoke last May, and I'm saying this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, knowing the Canadian situation. The voters spoke very clearly by not giving a majority to either of the 2 major parties. As a result, we have a new coalition government of Liberals and Conservatives, and they have set the target, hence the phrase age of austerity, which was quite predictable, but is now pretty certain, that over the next 4 years, the structural deficit in UK government spending will come down to 0. So from 11% of GDP to effectively 0 in 4 years. And that's a combination, as you would expect, of tax rises, welfare cuts, and cuts in government spending. So a real age of austerity for the public sector in the UK. The second phrase in the title is, or word in the title, is leadership, not leaders. This is not about needing more leaders or better leaders. It's about needing more leadership at all levels of the public sector. So that's the title. What I plan to cover, I'm going to talk first about the 3 leadership challenges facing public servants in the UK, and I suspect everywhere, because the deficit is only one of them. Then I'm going to move on and talk about what is it that your UK peers in the senior leadership of the public service are saying about all of this, and saying about what's happened in the last year. Thirdly, I'll move on and talk about, well, what do I mean by leadership at all levels? And then finally, what is it that you are going to do about it? Because the challenges, I think, are broadly the same in every country I speak, using the somewhat mystical phrase, doing what only you can do. 3 challenges. Now, I introduced the deficit and the scale of the challenge. On the 26th of October last year, the government published its comprehensive spending review, the product of a 3-month exercise looking at all areas of government spending. As a result of that, welfare benefits were cut by approximately 14% of the total forecast welfare benefit roll. About 20 billion Canadian dollars came out of forecast welfare benefits. Secondly, on the spending side, both parties in the coalition stuck by their pre-election promise to protect spending on health and international aid. So spending on health will continue to rise through the life of this government, and the UK will meet its Millennium Development Goal of 0.7% of GDP going into international aid. But as you can imagine, when you ring fence one of the biggest areas of government spending on health, and you've committed to drive down spending overall, that means the axe falls much more heavily on everything else. And as a result, all other areas of government spending, every other major department and local government is seeing a cut on average of 19% in real terms in their spending over the next 4 years. Now, as ever with inflation and government money, you look at it in nominal terms and the figure doesn't change very much. But in real terms, post-inflation, 19% reductions on average, which means some much higher, a few like defense and education somewhat lower. Now, when the coalition government was formed last May, I think there was actually a very substantial degree of public welcome for it and an understanding that they had a mandate for tough decisions. The reality is that the public likes to see its politicians working together. And I think there was a broad understanding that whoever was going to get elected last May was going to face significant spending reduction decisions. And it's pretty clear that although this government's done a shade more than Labour would have done something pretty similar. In fact, they'd published, when they were previously in power, their plans for pretty similar reductions. But now, let's see, 4 months after the comprehensive spending review and 9 months after the election, the honeymoon is clearly over. The big losers in this process have been welfare beneficiaries, seeing significant cuts in their benefits, and people on average to high tax rates who are seeing significantly higher taxes than 2 years ago, and taxes increased slowly over the previous 13 years of Labour government. So it is a long-standing trend of increasing taxation. But the big noise and objections are not really from either of those groups. It is, perhaps as you would predict, from the middle classes who are seeing their benefits from government being taken away, because to be frank, you can't afford to pay benefits to people who are on average earnings anymore. So the three issues which have got the most flack so far, I'm sure there's going to continue month by month for the next 4 years, are the withdrawal of child benefit. So believe it or not, the family of a Deloitte partner, with 2 of my 4 children still at home, we get benefit per head for each of those 2 children. Now, that is disappearing for all families who are on above average taxation rates. I won't bother you with the technicalities. But the outrage from people saying it wasn't fair that they were losing that benefit, even though they were on above average incomes, maybe not surprising, but quite instructive. Secondly, the group that's been out on the streets and most voluble are university students, because college fees are going to rise to the level where they cover the costs of a college education. May not seem too remarkable to you, but absolutely remarkable response out on the streets. And then the one that's just cropped up in the last few weeks, the government, which currently owns 10% of the forests in the UK, and despite being a very densely populated island, there is a great deal of forest cover. And this doesn't include the national parks, which are protected, but essentially commercial woodland is to be sold off to private ownership with protection for activities for family use of woods and so forth. But the outrage that that well-organized lobby group has been able to generate is quite extraordinary. So we're starting to see the reaction, and it's coming from, as you would expect, the organized middle classes. And we also had a shock last month when it was revealed that the first flash indication of Q4 GDP showed a decline. after the economy recovering quite steadily and better than levels in either the US or Canada through last year, there was a setback in the fourth quarter. And ultimately, all of this financial engineering, as our previous speaker said, is about economic growth and well-being. It's not about solving the deficit for its own sake. And clearly that remains a challenge. So that's the first. Second challenge is your theme, wicked problems, which I think we all talk about the same definition, complex and tightly coupled issues, which as a consequence are very resistant to intervention, because every intervention produces unforeseen consequences, and interventions which require behavior or adaptive change. So the coalition government, and indeed the senior leadership in the public sector, don't want to be known for cutting the deficit and cutting spending. It's not a very inspiring goal to set for yourself. What they want is to be known for making progress in some of the most resistant social problems that we and you share. And a belief which I think is correct, that with this coalition government representing 2/3 of the voters who cast a poll, they have got a mandate to take decisions and make change happen. So just to name a couple, health, where there's a radical decentralization of the health system happening, schools being opened up to parents having a legal right to open new schools, so-called free schools, schools being taken away from the control of local authorities, entitlement to funding direct from central government. One can debate quite whether these are all good or bad ideas, but they are extremely radical policy shifts for the UK. And finally, in welfare, the abolition of 14 different benefits which currently support people who are currently not in work for one reason or another, either can't work or unable to work for a variety of different reasons. And the replacement of those 14 benefits with one universal credit, which will always make it so that the recipient is better off in work than being on welfare. Now, as soon as you say that, you realize that that's going to be an expensive thing to do. So there are things in the pipeline that the government still wants to accomplish, which are now absorbing the civil service, working out how on earth do you do all of this by October 2013, which is when the universal credit scheme will open up. And by the way, you're also privatizing the whole welfare to work process. So there's just an enormous set of radical policy issues in play, tackling some of the most wicked problems in society. So that's challenge number 2, on top of cutting your spending by 19%. Challenge number 3, I alluded to in passing and in part when talking about health, is all about decentralizing government. And there were a lot of public servants when the new government was elected, and it was a strong theme of both the Liberal and the Conservative platforms to decentralize government. The UK is one of the most centralized states in the world, possibly second only to France and New Zealand, interestingly enough, in terms of percent of the government spend that takes place from the center. But the interesting thing about what both the Liberals and the Conservatives have done, which has disappointed many local government leaders in the UK, is this is not about decentralization from central government to local government. It's about decentralization, bypassing local government and taking decision-making and funding directly to users. So health funding is not moving to the local strategic health authorities or the district primary care commissioning authorities, which largely overlap with cities and counties. It's going directly to consortia of family general practitioners who are going to spend the money on behalf of their patients. In terms of schools, the funding is no longer going to go from central government through local authorities, with the local authorities then deciding how much each school gets. It's going to go directly to the schools. And the local authority education function is much, much reduced. In policing, the UK is going to introduce for the first time elected police and crime commissioners whose job it will be to control the local chief constable and the police budget for each area. So there's a radical program of localism going on, which is not shifting the balance of power in favor of local government. It's a whole new ballgame. So, wicked problems and wicked times indeed for public servants in the UK. Less resource to spend, radical policy changes, and decentralization away from government altogether. So, what are public sector leaders saying, and how are they coping with this? I won't say too much more, but happy to answer questions later about the first of these quotes, the formation of the coalition itself. So this was a quote from a permanent secretary, a deputy minister, who said the whole process of forming the coalition showed the civil service at its best. And one of the things which I think would be a challenge for yourself, and thinking about your 18-month timetable of elections ahead at provincial and federal level, is what happens when you have a rerun and you get the same result. The civil service in the UK prepared for the option of a hung parliament about a year in advance. So a manual was written and has since been issued for consultation. It used to be said the UK didn't have had an unwritten constitution, but since the Cabinet Office wrote this manual, I think we do now have a written constitution, and it was written by the senior civil servants. That manual underpinned a series of exercises, including role plays, where civil servants were identified to support each of the major political parties as they went through negotiating a coalition agreement. And individuals were found to play the role of the major political leaders. Now, I do much of this kind of preparatory scenario work with my clients, and the key is not that you predict what's happened, but you get used to the uncertainties that are inherent in the system. So when we actually got the result we did, it took only 5 days for the politicians, supported by Cabinet Office officials, to come up with a 7-page document, which was a program for government. And that, like the manual, is a godsend to political scientists, just new material which illustrates how politics actually works. Interesting enough, after the civil service smoothed out the document and amplified it and improved it, it went from a very punchy 7 pages stating what was what to 32 pages, much of which is very hard to work out quite what's going on.